Buenas tardes, bienvenidos, bienvenidas a todos los que están aquí. Qué bueno verles y estamos en vivo en Facebook también, así que buenas tardes a ustedes también por allá. El webinar de hoy, estamos hablando del cierre de escuelas públicas de Puerto Rico, cómo esto afectó a la comunidad y algunas recomendaciones que tenemos con respecto a estos cierres. El webinar de hoy va a ser en inglés, así que voy a cambiar voy a hacer el switch a inglés. So welcome to today's webinar, everybody. Hello. Today's webinar is Puerto Rico public school closures, how this affects the community, and future recommendations and path to move forward. So thank you so much for being here. My name is Glenis Pagan. I'm the Executive Director of Filantropía Puerto Rico. We are a philanthropy serving organization whose purpose really is to amplify, diversify, and increase the impact of philanthropic entities in everything that has to do with equity and social justice. So we're always looking to provide information that provokes the thoughts and gives us a discussed information of public issues that affect Puerto Rico. And that's why we do webinars. And this webinar is very important to us. I think the conversation at the end of today will be a very rich and deep one and very needed one. That's one of the reasons that we're doing this webinar in English, because we have discussed this locally in Spanish in many ways. Today's speaker has had many opportunities to talk about this, but we also wanted to expand the people that are talking about this to other friends and folks that have this issue that they really want to go deep in it. So at the end of the day, we can go English and Spanish, do your questions and your comments either way, whatever comes from the heart, even though the presentation will be in English. And if you have any questions, just send them over. We have a Q&A at the bottom. We have a chat, so you can either leave your questions on the Q&A on the chat during the presentation, and we'll take them at the end of today. So to get you started, let me start. So Puerto Rico Department of Education has closed nearly half of the public schools in Puerto Rico since 2007. An unprecedented 673 of its public schools, which is 44%, far outpacing the rate of change and the number of closures in Chicago, for example, the US school district with the second largest number of schools closures. The impact of Puerto Rico's closures on students, families, and surrounding neighborhoods is profound, yet it has largely been regarded as collateral damage of the necessary restructuring and payment of the country's debt. That's sure. In response to this, the Center for Habitat Reconstruction, in collaboration with the University of Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute, have published a report on the state of closed schools and their impact on their surrounding community. And today we'll be hearing about this report, and we'll be able to have time at the end of this conversation to talk about this. Before I present Luis and Grace, thank you guys so much for being here. I want to read their bios and then I'll hand it off to them to get started. So Luis Gallardo Rivera is the Executive Director for the Center for Habitat Reconstruction, a Puerto Rico-based nonprofit that assists communities and local governments address vacant and abandoned properties. Luis has worked in community development and with local governments in both Puerto Rico and the United States, advisor on municipal affairs, property rights, and tenure security for a number of public, private, and nonprofit organizations. He has a Master of Public Administration with a concentration in city management from Valdosta State University, Georgia, and a Juris Doctor from the University of Puerto Rico. And he also offers classes in the university, like I heard before in the backstage. So Grace Fontánez Valle is an operations associate with the Center for Habitat Reconstruction and has worked as coordinator for a number of legal pro bonos geared towards participatory democracy and citizen participation. She has also worked as a legislative assistant regarding municipal and community affairs, as well as a corporate law judicial assistant. Grace has a Master in Public Administration and a Juris Doctor from the University of Puerto Rico. Luis, Grace, We're honored to have you. Thank you for bringing this topic to our members and to all of us that are here on this webinar and on Facebook. I remind you guys, please, to leave your questions on the Q&A so you don't forget them. We'll address them at the end. Luis, te paso la palabra. Gracias por estar aquí.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Philanthropia for this space. Let me make sure I'm not on mute or anything like that. That's the new realities of our world.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I know that for some time now we wanted to talk a little bit more about the school issue, but I think now more than ever it's more relevant. I'm going to go ahead and transmit my screen. Just let me know if everything looks fine. Are we good?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much for the space. Just to give a little bit of background before we dive right into the topic per se. My name is Luis Gallardo, thank you so much for the introduction. And I am the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Habitat Reconstruction. It's a nonprofit 501c3 based out of right here in Puerto Rico, which seeks to address the issue of vacant and abandoned properties, working primarily with community-based organizations and city governments on designing property acquisition and disposition pipelines geared towards community development, resiliency, affordable housing, and so on. So that more or less is the spiel of the CRH in 2 sentences, and kind of give a little context of everything right now that we're dealing with here in Puerto Rico when it comes to the abandonment issue. It's very necessary to put this abandoned school issue within the wider lens of blight. According to the last numbers of the US Census, there's over 370,000 vacant homes in Puerto Rico. That number is a little bit difficult to process because it includes second housing or second homes, vacation homes, and so on. And there's another 30,000 or 300,000, I'm sorry, properties which are either ruined or damaged and are classified as other vacant by the US Census. So if we add those numbers, more or less, we're talking about 1 out of every 3 properties in Puerto Rico is either vacant or abandoned. But unfortunately, with these partial numbers, that's what we have to deal with in Puerto Rico. And anybody in pretty much any municipality in Puerto Rico just could drive to an urban center, a parcela, a rural community, or even a closed private urbanization. You'll see that there are abandoned buildings everywhere. On top of this, we have no idea how many abandoned commerce, how many businesses, how many industrial spaces or empty lots there are. That's something the US Census does not count, so we could only imagine. Especially those who have lived or worked in the South can attest to the large number of vacant and abandoned industrial parks that are just sitting there. And on top of that, to make matters worse, we have almost 700 closed schools. And today we're going to dive in a little bit about what those closed schools look like today, how we came about that number, and some of the other challenges and findings that we've stumbled upon in the last year as we've studied this issue in more detail. And before I kind of get into the study per se, and kind of just to echo what Denise was mentioning about the closings of the schools, we have seen a steady drop over the last 10 years in the amount of schools that are being closed on a yearly basis. There was a time where almost every year we were getting new announcement that 100 schools are going to be closed, 200 schools are going to be closed, and so on. And as you can tell by this chart, that number just accelerated until we hit the current numbers, 2018, 2019. And this represents about 40-something% of the schools. We're almost hitting the 50% mark, but this number here is quite shocking. It's something that we've seen a lot when we're working with communities. We would be carrying out community inventories, and we would see that, of course, we'd find 7, 8, 9 abandoned properties, but the biggest abandoned property was owned by the government, and it was a school that was being closed. So we were seeing that, when we were looking at public nuisances, publicly owned schools were part of that inventory. So maybe rewind back 2 years in an Art Place conference in Wisconsin, if I remember correctly. I ran into Eli Moore from the University of Berkeley, and they were presenting a fascinating study on housing in Richmond, California. It was a beautiful study. It's very thorough. It's very clear cut, very balanced. And the study caught my attention, and we just started chatting it up and talking about Puerto Rico's abandonment issues. And that's when we got on the topic of abandoned schools. So we made a pitch to the University of Berkeley in hopes to kind of co-author a research paper after a couple of visits to Puerto Rico and chats, we decided to move forward with a formal publication. So on our end, on the CRH, the group that put together our part of the study included Marina Moscoso Arabia, myself, and Grace. Marina is an urbanist. I myself, along with Grace, we both studied both public administration and law. Among us three, we pretty much had the abandonment issue here in Puerto Rico by the tail. We knew it very well. We worked on a day-to-day basis, but we did need that assistance from sort of an investigative body that could help us with it. So that's when we linked up with Berkeley, and these are some of the investigators that assisted us. Eli Moore is a geographer. Dalia is a urban planner. Wendy is a finance specialist, and EJ was a public policy analyst. So we had a really nice team put together. We decided that Puerto Rico, our end, would deal more with the quantitative research in the streets. We would go visit the schools and see how they are, and then they would help us from afar and through a number of visits to Puerto Rico regarding geographic analysis and so on. And that's when we put together our study. And let me see if, yeah, right here, kind of jumped a slide. So some of the components that this study includes, and I'm gonna kind of dive into a couple of the findings. I asked Grace to join in as well so that she could talk about a number of the findings that she specifically worked on. Just to clarify, Grace is no longer with us at the CRH, but she's giving us, she's doing us a favor and agreed to join in. I think it demonstrates her her compromiso, her allegiance to this topic. So we're very happy to have her on, and she's going to be helping us with a number of those findings. So one of the things we first did with the study is we carried out a literary review of public documents that were already available. We looked up lists of closed schools. We looked up documents, circular letters, regulations, and so on to kind of see how the government and the local level was managing school closings. We also did a comparative review of different research papers that were published throughout the previous years throughout the United States to try to identify tendencies that already exist in other research. We did a quantitative review of the sales and rental contracts. That's what Grace is going to get into. We actually went into every single sales and rent contract during the peak of the school closing phases. And we kind of looked into what they were being used for and what their status is today. We carried out a very extensive field investigation for the schools that were closed. We visited quite a number of schools throughout the entire island. We did a randomized sample. I think of that and my back hurts because of the endless hours that we spent driving across the island to get photos and document some of these schools. So it was very tedious. But we also did a geospatial analysis after we were able to pin the location of all of those abandoned schools. And we also did qualitative research towards the end, including focus groups. We met with teachers, we met with students, community groups, we met with individuals who've been able to obtain schools and so on. And this kind of all wrapped together became what our study is. So the study is quite extensive. At the end of the presentation, I'll share a link, and that link could also be shared through the chat, so everybody will have an opportunity to see it. But I'm going to emphasize 8 findings from the study, and these are the most 8 that I think are relevant to this group. And we're going to get into 3 recommendations towards the end. Again, there's plenty of findings, there's plenty of recommendations, but due to time constraints, we're just going to kind of dig in on these. But the first finding that we reached was that the school closings here in Puerto Rico, they were not only massive in numbers, but it was unprecedented. We could not find anywhere else in the United States where so many schools were closed in such a short amount of time. And here's a comparative analysis showing you the different jurisdictions that are known for having widespread school closings. And as you can see, Puerto Rico pretty much hits it out of the park with this one. Even when you tabulate for proportional population per school and so on, Puerto Rico still is off the chart. So it was just an unprecedented amount of schools that were being closed. I know on a personal level, I was trying to work with a community group to get a school rescued, and then we get the news that another 5 schools are going to be closing in the city, and it just spun out of control. It was so difficult for us to keep track of that. So the second finding we found was that the actual Department of Education was quite in the dark. They had no idea of what they were sitting on. They did not have a centralized list of abandoned schools. They had lists per year of closing, and some of those schools, when we would visit them, some of them were still open. Sometimes we'd find 2 schools, or the names were wrong, and all of the things of the sort. They didn't have any geolocated information. Mainly Grace and I would poke around trying to find where the school is. We'd have to pull over and ask neighbors. and so on until we can track them down. So the actual Department of Education was just completely clueless as to how many schools were abandoned. They couldn't give us numbers. There was no centralized management of the schools. Some of the schools were owned by the department. We found schools that were owned by the Department of Housing and so on. Agencies would not provide information. It was a stone wall. We were trying to request lists of schools that were closed, that were not cooperative at all. In fact, at one point, we even considered filing what a state equivalent would be to like the Freedom of Information Act, trying to get a hold of some of these documents, but due to time constraints, we decided to just move forward with the study and so on. We had to scour press releases and newspaper reports on the matter just to get lists of the schools that were closed on a year-to-year basis. We had to track down inside documents from the Department of Education. It was a pain. One of the things I did want to stress was that there was one instance where we were really frustrated because we couldn't find a list of schools closed during one certain period. And despite repeated attempts from myself, from Grace, we just could not get a hold of them. One of the University of Berkeley researchers called in perfect English and presented themselves as an investor, and within 30 minutes got a list of the schools. So that kind of demonstrates how cooperative they are with certain populations, but for researching purposes, they were just not very, very effective. Yes.
And yes, it's important that we have a list of closed schools, and when we got there, they were open. Some schools were announced as closed, but they were open. That was another thing that make us work harder. Yeah.
Yeah, we lost many resources visiting schools that the department thought was closed, and they turned out they were open. And sometimes we would see that the reason they're open is because a politician or a legislator kind of meddled into the issue and pushed the education department to keep it open. So definitely, and one of the things we found, that the Department of Education looks like it didn't even know was some of these schools had received very generous investments in the prior years. This is one particular school that had new parking lot paved, it had building repairs, it was recently painted, it even had an electric system that was just recently upgraded and kind of created a new transformer system for this school. And now that school is demolished. It was purchased, it was demolished, and now it's changed hands a couple times, and it's still kind of just an empty lot at this time. So we saw a lot of that. We even saw schools that just 2 or 3 years prior had a little sign stating that this school has been adopted by so-and-so mayor, or the school is under construction for something, and so on. So one of our third findings was that the proceedings to close schools year after year, regardless of what administration was in power, was very trampling, or in Spanish, atropellador, lacked transparency. Parents sometimes would come to school the last day of school, would find out that the school is going to be closed for the next school year, so you got to just deal with it on your own. There was inconsistencies, as Grace said. A lot of these schools, were supposed to be closed and then they're open. Schools were merged and so on. There was absolutely no participation whatsoever from parents, teachers, or students, and these were based on absolute variables. And I put in parentheses spreadsheets from San Juan, because literally a lot of these schools were closed by a bureaucrat sitting behind a computer with a spreadsheet. And I recall one particular case where there was 2 schools in a rural area, and the population in the area had gone down. It's something that parents were well aware of, and they acknowledged the schools just simply, both of them could not stay open. They were not opposed to one of the schools closing. Nevertheless, the Department of Education decided that school A would be closed and school B would stay open. The parents from both schools would have a fit because school A was just in a better physical condition. It had ramps, it had specialized classrooms for students with special education and so on. But due to a calculation difference of 1 or 2 students signed up in these schools, the Department of Education flagged the first one to be closed. And after months of protests and strikes and things of the sort, the Department of Education refused to meet with the parents. And the Department of Secretary, head at that time, Julia Kelleher, stated that if she were to accommodate the community's request, then she was going to have to accommodate every community. These schools just had to be closed, and that's it. So that's one example of how there was absolutely no parent participation and how a lot of these decisions were taken very, very coldly. And these schools were closed due to supposed fiscal benefits. I recall very well stories about how much money these schools could generate for the government, who was eagerly trying to pay their bills and so on. And as Grace hinted to, there was also a lot of political meddling with the schools. We found schools that were adopted by Senate offices just to keep them open and so on. And you would see that quite a bit. Here's an example of one school in Caguas where parents, in a last ditch effort to protest the closing of the school. And it's also a very sad portrayal of how they felt about it, put their students and their children's uniforms on the front gate of the school, sort of as a silent protest and so on. And you can see messages on those shirts that were written in Sharpie talking about how they're killing the education of the country and so on. So it left a very, very bad flavor in the mouth of a lot of these families. This fourth finding, schools were meant much more for communities than just centers for education. We identified that 44% of these closed schools had community facilities that were not being used. You would see children playing in the street, but on the other side of the fence, you would see a basketball court that was recently renovated that was part of a closed school and was shut off to the rest of the community. We saw theaters, we saw baseball parks, basketball parks, playgrounds, all kinds of cool stuff. But unfortunately, they were part of the school closings. Communities did not have access to them, and a lot of these communities were underserved. Another thing we found that 10% of these properties could be considered historic properties. And also a lot of these schools doubled as voting centers and even as refugee centers. And here's an example of one school that was vandalized that had a plaque talking about its historic significance and so on. It is a property with much historic relevance. Let's see, okay. Here's another example of a school that was closed. It was a structurally able school, but the school, that little sign there, states that it's a refuge for natural disasters. We even found schools with signs with nuclear shelters in their basements. So a lot of these schools doubled also as very crucial facilities during emergency management. A lot of these schools were occupied by families during hurricanes Irma and Maria, and no longer are an asset for communities to seek shelter. Another finding that we found was that these closings disproportionately affected low-income and rural communities. We know that tabulating racial groups in Puerto Rico is quite tricky with the US Census. A lot of nonprofits have talked about how frustrating it could be, but also it was very effective. It was very impacting in a negative sense on communities with higher Afro-Puerto Rican populations. And we dive a little bit more into that, and some of the most vulnerable groups within Puerto Rico were suffering disproportionately from the closings of schools. And we have some really nice maps throughout the study that later we'll share. Finding number 6, the closings affected students' access to education. And this is a little photograph that I like using when talking about this. This is a chalkboard that someone wrote on before they left for their last day of class. And what's interesting about it is, they're complaining. They're saying, we have 197 students. How is it that other schools that have 100 are not being closed? This is unfair. Why are they going to close this school to put another one? Probably speaking about private schools, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But what's really fascinating is this is very poorly written. So a lot of grammatical errors on this message on the wall, which kind of shows the ironic realities that despite the fact that you have a population that needs access to education, they're being denied it and so on. And just to give you an idea, from 2015 to 2019, the amount of students that now require transportation to school, the numbers just mushroom. We're talking about more than twofold increase on the amount of students that need to take transportation right on a bus to get to their schools. We also dove into newspaper reports, complaints from mayors and so on, because it was a very difficult to coordinate effort. The Department of Education kind of would delegate to city governments the need to do school transportation, and that just was a big headache. So we see actually in the numbers just how many students now have to hop on a bus to get to their schools. Now, when we talk about the student absentee rate, we're talking about almost a 9-fold increase on the amount of students that were missing out on their class, and also school desertion rates, almost a 3-fold increase the amount of students that were leaving high school. When we would compare the dropout rate with geographic distribution of the school closings, we would see that there were higher desertion rates in each of those regions. So interesting data as well. Now I'll pass it on to Grace, who did all of the hard work of going contract by contract, and let her talk a little bit about these next findings.
So, in terms of finding the contracts and how much closed schools were really closed, we do a research in the Oficina of Contralor, el Contralor de Puerto Rico. I don't know how to name it in English, Controller's Office. We find 123 contracts of the schools that were closed, and we literally open every contract and see what was happening with the schools. With that contracts, we only see that 10 of the 123 contracts were actually selling schools. On another 25 only contracts were really doing what we're supposedly to be doing. So Puerto Rico was selling school or was closing schools to sell, but they were not selling anything and gaining money of that. So we were on the streets and looking for that schools that were selling, and we saw that mostly of the schools that were closing and have a contract were vacant. Some of them, they were like having structure damages. Some of them, they were without windows and doors. There were nothing what's happening with them. So what we think was perfect for the study was like, okay, we were going to get photos of them and document what was happening with those closed schools. No me acuerdo, I don't really remind, Luis, if you can actually tell me how much schools were actually closed. I think it was 82 of them, of the 119 that we actually were pinning.
Yeah, the breakdown right here.
Yes, yeah, 82 of them were vacant, right? 82
that's
of
right.
them.
It was about 69%.
Yes, 69 of them were vacant. So nothing was happening with that schools, and the community was like actually wanting them to use them and make some schools or head starts or use them like a sport schools. And 25 of them were reused. Some of the municipalities got them back and make some schools, make some administration thing with the municipality, and 6 of them were like having a human use. There were signs of human use, like they were having mattresses there, food, some medical things, and some of them have water and light, right? Okay. Yes, and this is a slide where it confirms that it was only 10 of them sold from some corporations, and of that 10, I think there were only 3 of them in use. The other 7 were in use. They were sold, but were in use. They were vacant too. 113 were rented. Some of the rent ones were from municipalities and some sin fines de lucro, ONG, that have them for use them to give some services to the community. So the one that were on contract, that's 123, 45 of them went direct services for the community. Some of them were medical service, a school service. The other 11% was from schools that were ONGs that gave services from school, tutories, or some educational services the 28% for educational programs like night school for people, adult people, and the other 16% was for other services like sports services. Some were giving some type of administration thing on Head Start from municipalities. And there were like 2 or 3 that they were like animals como establos de caballo.
Yeah.
I don't know how to.
Yeah,
Can you talk about the establos de caballo?
Yeah, I think there's a photo later on in the presentation, but we did find schools that were abandoned that kind of have been turned into makeshift horse stables. And it was actually, I think about 9 or 10% of schools throughout Puerto Rico are currently being used as horse stables. And one interesting point is these categorizations are created by the Department of Education when they would sign the contracts. They would kind of classify what the use would be. So I included this picture here because among direct services, they did include churches. There were a lot of abandoned schools that were now owned by churches. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, the important one is that the ones that were transferred to municipalities and the municipality assigned another services for them. So that was a very hard thing to do because most of them were assigned to the municipalities, and when they came to municipality hands, we don't know what service the municipality will do. Even after the sale, and 42% of them is still vacant. That's why one of our conclusion was Puerto Rico was closing schools, but we weren't doing nothing with that closed schools. And right now, 42% is still vacant, and we can do something with them. This school right now is in Viejo San Juan. That school was sold for a corporation, a big corporation that bought 4 schools, and the 4 schools that they bought were vacant. So they bought their schools, some important schools near the beaches, but they do nothing with them.
Yeah, there's the number, 11% horses. I'm not sure you know how difficult it was for me to find the icon for a horse.
The mostly of the schools have overground vegetation. That was the common thing among them. 40 of them was vandalized. 32 was have accumulation of trash. 26 have conservation waste. 11 of them were horse stables, and 7 of them have graffitis.
Yeah, it was quite common to see schools that were just like this. This could be any school in any town where we see that the windows have been stripped. They took away even the lamps. I recall once visiting a school during school hours and would see children ripping the copper out of old printing cartridges so they could go sell it to make money. So we would see this throughout the island. And again, some of those documents on the floor would be school reports, assignments, sometimes it'd be school student files and so on. So this here could demonstrate pretty much any abandoned school throughout the island.
And some people were leaving with the document information and personal information of the students because we saw human use among the schools.
This is an aerial photograph that we've included of another school. The school building is towards the left. This is a sort of a basketball park that was constructed. It was actually recently constructed prior to the school's closing. Most of the metals have been stripped from the edges and so on, and you could see that they're using this as an illegal landfill. And one of the interesting points is if you take note, there's vegetation growing on that trash, which means it's been there for a while. And also take note of that heavy machinery. So they are using this as illegal dumping site. And there's the horse. Grace, do you want me to go at this, or do you want?
Some of the most of schools have an optimal condition. It was proved that when with the closing schools that they're closed recently, the more time we have to conduct another services or reuse them, the more time we get to do that, the more bad condition we find. So recently, the 59% was having optimal conditions. They can be reused. 22% of them only have left some windows and doors, but they can be reused because we can put the windows and doors back. The 7% of them have a poor condition, having some structural damages, and 12% was bad condition. So the 12% you can use anymore.
Now, diving a bit into some of the recommendations. Again, the study outlines quite a number of them. And again, at the end of the presentation, we'll have a number of links for both the Spanish and English versions of the paper. But I'm going to concentrate on some main recommendations and consolidate a couple of them. But one of the first conclusions was that a moratorium needed to be approved on further school closings. We cannot keep closing schools in the dark without having any sort of protocol or anything of the sort. Fortunately, the current administration's stance is that no more schools need to be closed. That's sort of like almost a paradox, because through COVID, we've had to close schools. But this demonstrates that as those schools are closed, they will be vandalized, they will be damaged. So without a doubt, no more school closings should be permitted. Fortunately, the Federal Control Board has also backed off on the issue. At first, they really pushed it, but now they've kind of calmed down a bit. I think I don't think they actually stated that they've acknowledged that there are no real savings in the school closings per se. And the schools that are open but are temporarily closed, such as the COVID issue, do need to be maintained. Plans need to be put into place to prevent their deterioration. We've heard of cases where the government thought that a school was okay, and for an election, said, yeah, the school's available as a voting center. And then when, election officials would show up a couple of weeks prior, they'd see that the school was completely ripped apart and deteriorated. So in the future, one of the things we suggested that there is a reuse plan if any school ever needs to be closed. One thing I would like to interject here is, Puerto Rico has suffered drastic demographic and economic changes as well. And there are instances where, you can't justify a school staying open for 9 students, which is one case that I heard of, for example. But we do think that prior to closing a school, that is a public investment, that is money that has been spent on a building, it is a public asset, needs to be protected, and having a reuse plan in place prior is one of the ways to protect that investment. Second recommendation, we need a fair, uniform, and participatory protocol for reuse. Right now, those are decisions that are made pretty much behind closed doors with a very small committee that's 100% government ran. Parents, students, teachers, and staff do need to play a role in these closings, and we also need to prioritize municipal housing and community development when we review reuse proposals. Right now, it's kind of flipped around. They prioritize the sales, which puts investors and private developers at an advantage that community groups simply don't have. A lot of the things that we see when we're working in these communities, and in fact, I saw earlier Sofia and Dershan, both connected to this chat. Both of them can attest that one of the biggest fears we see in the community is, we want to invest our time and effort in making the school a community resource, but we don't want someone to come and sweep it up from us or to buy it from us, or for the city to take it away for us to sell to an investor. So that's a fear that we see a lot in the field. We also need to recognize the value of schools beyond their economic worth. As we said, schools do have a special place within each of these communities. They do have community facilities, and they do serve other purposes as well. We do think that private sales should be the last option. That's one of the things that we think needs to change with the public policy, needs to be flipped around. Now, the fiscal law here in Puerto Rico, Law 27, which facilitates the sale of these schools, states that the schools can be sold if there are no public uses. Nevertheless, there's no process or filter to identify public uses. So we're really not making that much of an effort. And last on this point, we do need clawback clauses. As Grace pointed out, there are abandoned buildings that were sold for very aggressive projects that never materialized. And some of these contracts lack clawback clauses, which allow for the city or the government to take the school back if the school project has failed. Recommendation number 3, and I know that there are probably many groups here that are already doing this, they need to support community-driven reuse of schools. We need a framework, we need pilot projects for communities to work off. We receive a lot of community groups that come to our organization asking for technical assistance. Fortunately, we've been able to put together like a model proposal that we could share with them, and we kind of try to run them through the process. Nevertheless, during the previous years, every group that we've worked with or that I've worked in my personal capacity has had to submit themselves to a completely different process. So due to this lack of uniform protocol, there's kind of a shortage of frameworks and so on. We do need to do capacity and consensus building in communities. There's one community group I saw, for example, in Loíza, where there were numerous groups fighting over one school, but then they sat down, reached a consensus, and lots of these schools can be divided up into multiple facilities for different groups. And we do need to foster those community municipal partnerships. Communities can work with their city governments to, kind of create mixed use projects for these. And recommendation number 4, and this is something that I think is more relevant now than ever regarding COVID, and Grace and I were kind of chatting about this earlier. COVID now requires social distancing, open air activities, and more public spaces. So now we need smaller classroom sizes, we need more schools, we need more space. So this provides an excellent opportunity for us to tap in some of those schools that are still in a good condition and that we can salvage. We also need to prioritize municipalities on the southern coast that have been hit hard by earthquakes. I recall when I drove to the south not too long after we started our school spotting project, I would see a 4-story school that seemed like it didn't have more than 3 or 4 years of age collapsed due to the hurricanes. But a few streets down, you would see this really old school from the 60s that was still in place and did not have one crack in it. So we've heard stories about cities in the South that have no schools, that now they have no schools, that they've had to rent carps, or in fact, there was a controversy once where they were going to rent like a hotel for millions of dollars to hold their schools there. So we do need to prioritize some of those municipalities in the South. And we did identify that 94% of these closed schools have more than one structure. 30% of these schools have 5 or more. So there are plenty of opportunities for mixed use. In fact, recently we were discussing with one of our partner groups, a school that was going to be closed, and now they decided they weren't going to close it, but it's still underused and they have all the space they're not using. We do need to work on those collaborations from the get-go.
Yes.
Now,
finally, we found out in the study that 15 of the schools have only a first floor, and they were in optimal condition to use. So for the southern part of Puerto Rico, this is a data that they really have to find out and use them, because they can use the schools right now.
Now, these links, we'll go ahead and share these momentarily in the chat. It's actually quite interesting. bit.ly, the bit.ly, that's like the URL shortener. CRH study for the English version, CRH Estudio for the Spanish version. It's completely free. We have limited printed copies, but those are more for our partners when we're doing work in the community, but you can download the PDF for free in either of those 2 languages. So that is available for anybody who wants to dig in a little bit more. And again, this is our contact information, just in case there's any questions or comments. That's our general email. That's my phone number, just in case. And that's our Facebook page. So please follow us if you want to stay up to date with our activities on a day-to-day basis. So that's pretty much it. I know that we have questions. Awesome. And so on. So.
Yes, Luis, Grace, gracias. This was wonderful. And it's amazing because just listening to you, you can, it could really bring up some stuff, some feelings, some emotions, while listening to all this data. So I really appreciate it. Looking forward to this conversation now. So please go ahead and leave your questions on the Q&A. We already have a couple of questions. Let's start over here. But at the bottom of your screen, en la parte de abajo del screen, hay un icono de Q&A. Just leave your questions there, either English or Spanish. We'll manage. So first questions, what type of agencies were not providing information? Wondering who had information about closing, if not Department of Education.
None of them.
That was a very interesting thing. I mean, how could they not have consolidated information of schools closing?
Yeah, well, sometimes it was difficult to interpret whether or not they just didn't have the data or if they didn't want to share it. It was hard to maneuver that. But primarily the Department of Education and AFAF, which is sort of like the lead agency, which is supposed to oversee all of these school closing processes. At that time, they were not very accessible. We recently had a little more success communicating with them and clarifying doubts. But like I said, we were considering, and I think we mentioned this in one of our footnotes, we were considering going to court to try to get some of these documents so that we could carry out this research. Nevertheless, we opted for just investing, man and woman hours in compiling this data manually, which was a challenge. And unfortunately, it costs money that could be used in other things.
But it validated, because at the same time you had data, like Grace was mentioning, there were schools that said we were closed and they were open, or vice versa. So cool. Next question. So a reason for school closings cited by the former secretary Kelleher was the decline in student population. You say that nearly half of the schools were closed. Was this in line with the decline in student population, or are the remaining schools now overcrowded?
Half of your question was chopped up. I don't know if it was my internet, but I hear about the decline in student population.
So, the reason, even though your first chart says that it's been more than 10 years that we've been closing schools, right? But the reason for schools closing from former secretary was decline in student population. So you say that nearly half of the schools were closed. Was this in line with the decline in student population, or are the remaining schools now overcrowded?
The latest numbers we had when we were working on the study, again, this study was published back in August and September, prior to the whole COVID pandemic. Yes, they were increasing the classroom size per student, which tends to go against the best practice, which is try to achieve the lowest classroom size as possible. Yes, they are increasing the classroom size. They did consolidate schools. That drop in student populations is not proportional to the amount of schools that were being closed. So yes, we acknowledge that there was a population decline. Nevertheless, there were fiscal pressures, and there were also economic pressures with specific schools that potential investors could purchase in very prime real estate areas, such as we saw on the West Coast, and Grace kind of mentioned that could be used for hotels and so on. So yes, there was a student decline. Interestingly enough, the amount of students that needed to get school transportation increased. Despite the drop in student decline. So proportionally speaking, it'd be nice to kind of do that analysis.
Yeah, definitely the way that was planned, the structure was not very organized. So changing to Spanish. En este momento, ¿cuál es el plan actualizado con estas escuelas para reuso, ya sea por organizaciones sin fines de lucro y bases comunitarias o municipios? ¿Cuál sería el proceso de rescatar las mismas y que sean de beneficio a las comunidades?
Okay,
esa es la pregunta.
En el plan en la venta, transferencia o cesión de propiedades, hubo tres cosas básicas que se estaban tomando en consideración. Primero, si era un municipio y si el municipio tenía algún tipo de necesidad para utilizar la escuela. La segunda era organizaciones sin fines de lucro que iban a proveer un servicio educativo o de primera necesidad para la comunidad. Y la tercera era para venta de mercado para generar dinero para el gobierno de Puerto Rico. La venta de mercado no tuvo efecto. Lo que mayormente se hacía era que se estaban transfiriendo a los municipios para que los municipios dieran servicios educacionales o de primera necesidad directamente a la comunidad. Y lo otro poco que se hacía era a organizaciones sin fines de lucro para que dieran servicio. Sin embargo, una de las herramientas que el gobierno no estaba ofreciendo en ese momento era un proceso justo y equitativo para que las organizaciones pidieran esa escuela o fueran a hacer su propuesta para adquirir una escuela. Al momento, no sé en qué quedamos, es una pregunta que por lo menos a mí me hacen semanalmente, y es cómo una organización sin fines de lucro puede adquirir una escuela.
Sí, esa es una pregunta, tenemos una
estudio.
pregunta de esa en Facebook. Como que, ¿qué puedo hacer? ¿Dónde consigo esta lista? ¿Qué hago?
En el momento en que se hizo este estudio, estaba el comité en Fortaleza donde tú presentabas una propuesta y ellos evaluaban. Ahora, se tardaban muchísimo en contestarte porque tener mucha gente en el comité significaba que no podían agendar una reunión para todos el mismo día a la misma hora. Ahora el proceso cambió y lo tiene AFAF. No sé si Luis puedes abarcar sobre el proceso de adquisición de escuela, porque sé que lo has trabajado últimamente, o por lo menos has cooperado con unas organizaciones para hacerlo.
Una cosa que sí me gustaría enfatizar es que
en el comité significaba que no podían agendar.
Hay un delay. Una de las cosas que sí creo que hay que enfatizar es que, tal como dice Grace, ahora hay un enfoque de venta y que el mercado no lo ha podido aguantar. Simplemente no hay suficiente capital ni mercado para comprar a precio de tasación cada una de las escuelas. Inclusive, ahora mismo lo que hace el gobierno es que ya no venden propiedades a dólar, ya venden las propiedades a valor de mercado y pueden hacer un arrendamiento por $1. Sin embargo, hay un proceso anual de recertificación y hay presiones donde ellos como que, mira, pero la quieres comprar. Hemos visto casos donde mandan la organización a hacer tasaciones y mandan a la organización a clarificar cuestiones de título y escritura, lo cual podrá ser injusto porque yo organización lo alquilo a dólar, gasto chavos en una escritura y en una tasación para que venga un privado y me lleve a la escuela. Además, no hay un protocolo que establece prioridades. Ahora mismo, las concesiones a las comunidades es la excepción. La prioridad ahora mismo es venta. Y hay que reconocer que el mercado simplemente no puede aguantar todo eso.
Sí, y volvemos a lo mismo. De las 123 escuelas, solamente se vendieron 10 al momento del estudio, y de esas 10, aproximadamente 6 estaban sin utilizar y no estaban cumpliendo el propósito de la venta para la cual se vendió. Valía la redundancia. Sí. Así que la venta no asegura que esas estructuras van a volver a utilizarse y que vayan a ser funcionales para la comunidad. ¿Verdad? No se estaban dando ningún servicio en esas escuelas que se vendieron. Así que estamos teniendo el mismo problema de propiedades abandonadas.
Exacto. Yeah. So, próxima pregunta, y creo que I think you answered. Was a protocol document created for how to deal with this issue in the future? Do you know? I don't think so.
Yeah, there is no protocol per se. There is each closing had its own protocol, and that's why each of the groups that I've worked with have had to go through different hoops. They'd have different processes, and it wasn't consistent. I don't know where they stand on today, whether or not they've created a consistent process. I do know that they eliminated the comité that Grace mentions that was based out of Fortaleza. Now the schools are treated as any other property, whether it's a parking lot or abandoned field that's owned by the government. Now, one thing I did want to mention is we have recently seen in the state legislature the filing of Senate Bill 274, which is based on this research project. They take our findings and our recommendations and they're turning them into bill proposals. So I suggest everybody go check out PS 274. While we're chatting, I'm gonna go ahead and put a link to like a one-page summary of that project. It's right now in Senate committee, so they're reviewing it, but the idea is to create a protocol through law that would prioritize community, municipal, affordable housing, and nonprofit uses, and have sales as the last option, among other things, as well as creating mechanisms for community participation. So no, there is no guide. I've heard of people kind of cooking the idea of creating one. I know that there are a number of groups such as ours that will be publishing, guidebooks or guidelines and so on for a number of issues that have to do with abandoned properties. So we might touch onto that, but it's not like there's a definitive guide. There's not even like a definitive protocol right now on how to acquire those schools.
Cool. So a couple more questions. So we end up at top of the hour. So how did you distribute your report locally? Have you seen evidence of the impact within government agencies? Interesting question. Thank you, Raul.
We disseminated physical copies to nonprofits that we were familiar with that worked on the matters. We also freely handed out when we're in community groups. We sent a copy to every legislature, both outgoing and incoming. And I do think
every mayor.
And every mayor, yeah. And the mayors loved it. I would actually see some of them coming out of meetings that week with the report in their hands. So but you know, with the mayors, I think we're singing to the choir because they're usually the ones who have to pick up the cost for maintaining these properties that the state has abandoned. But yes, I do see an impact. We do have that Senate Bill 274, which was filed recently. So we would like to invite everybody to go check that out. Again, I'm going to put a link in a moment so that we could all take a look at it and call your legislator and ask them to approve 274, again, to create community mechanisms for the recovery of schools.
Perfect. Okay, so I am not sure how to put this into a clear question. I'll try. Luis mentioned that many of the schools that have been reopened are now charter schools or private schools with tuition that are Christian in their focus and curriculum. Have you seen any data on what the success rate is in such entities getting schools and if they are being favored in the transfers?
Yes, in our paper, and again, please check the link. It does break down the number of schools, particularly religious private academies that have obtained schools. And one thing that we did see, you know, there is a large number of these properties that are being used for education and school purposes, but they're being used for religious-based and private schools. Remember that all of these closings also accompanied public policy geared towards austerity and privatization. The school reform bill also includes a voucher program and a charter school model and so on. So this report identifies this problem within the context of a wider public policy geared towards austerity. And that's why we see that graffiti on that wall that was saying, why are they going to close our school to open another one? And obviously it's going to be a school that has a different scope. It's not a community-based school and so on. So yeah, without a doubt, the study does talk about the process of these private schools and churches, like straight up churches that just gotten properties. That's discussed as well in our study.
Cool, perfect. I have three questions which are very, very similar, and so I'll kind of put them all together and we'll end up with this. Una es, su organización tiene planes futuros respecto a involucrarse en el rescate de las escuelas y yo continuar estudiando este tema. And then I'll leave that, like what is CRH, you know, planning on getting involved. And then sounds like community organization is crucial to progress and improvement. Are there any communities in particular that are making promising and solid progress in the success of their organizing efforts? And that, if you go into your chat, si vas en el chat, tenemos a Sofía que nos da unos comentarios y también preguntan, ¿saben cuántas escuelas abandonadas están en manos de comunidades? ¿Les han comunicado a estos medios en su investigación? So I'll leave you that as a closing question. Either English or Spanish, however you want.
Without a doubt, currently we are supporting 4 communities with different placemaking and or community planning projects. And for all of them, abandoned schools are a relevant issue. But there is one particular community in Cahuitas, Aguas Buenas, where we are supporting the community in trying to rescue a school with a wonderful agricultural project and a multi-use project, which kind of divvies up among different community groups. So without a doubt, and we're currently exploring the possibility to go into a second school pending the availability of funding. Now, as for schools or communities that do have good examples, Sofia is quite familiar with one of them, San Anton in Carolina. A wonderful, powerful group of community leaders, all women who've decided to take charge of a school and are working on that quite closely, as well as the Emiliano Figueroa Torres school in Loíza, which also has been rescued by not only the community group, but nonprofits who have collaborated as well. So there are quite a number of good success stories, as well as Goico in San Juan, which is the product of a municipal community partnership. And they just had a wonderful jazz concert last week with William Cepeda, who is also trying to make moves to rescue a space within a school to carry out, community and music programs.
Aproximadamente, yo diría que 90 escuelas cerradas han sido reutilizadas por entidades educativas sin fines de lucro o organizaciones sin fines de lucro que dan servicio directo a la comunidad.
Okay, so clarification question. Are they being approved more so than community efforts that are secular or based on mutual aid? That was from that prior question of schools reopening, as Christian schools.
Yeah, there is a disproportionate number of them that are Christian schools. Schools that are being reopened as private schools definitely are being there's a disproportionate number. And if not Christian or religious-based schools, they are private tuition-based schools. Very few exceptions. Someone mentioned the Instituto Nueva Escuela, which has done a wonderful job of maintaining public access to school, and also Nuestra Escuela, which also is using a school in Loíza, which is also a free alternative education school. That are the exceptions, but yeah, there is a disproportionate number of for-profit and Christian schools which obtain these buildings.
Beautiful, cool. Well, I think that's it. Thank you everybody so much for your question. Luis, Grace, thank you for your time, this wonderful study, and for really popping up this information. We need to continue exploring and see how we can support these communities that really want to get their school back. So gracias y gracias a todos los que participaron. We will be sharing a feedback form. Please, actually, it's being sent here by Richard. Go ahead and fill that out. It takes less than 3 minutes. Let us know how we did on this webinar and what other topics you'd like to hear about. You will get a recording of this recording, and we will have it in filantropiapr.org, the recording with all the links and the presentation and everything for everybody to be. So thank you so much. Have a great evening. Luis, Grace, mil gracias. Se cuidan. Chao. Buenas tardes.